And thank you very much for giving us some time out of your day or evening whenever you have a chance to watch this. I'm Corey Saylor. I'm the Research and Advocacy Director with the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I'll let my colleague and the report author introduce herself.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Farah Hafifi and I'm the Research and Advocacy Coordinator at CAIR. I'm also the primary author of the report just released today and delivered to over 400 university leaders, Hostile: How Universities Target Anti-Genocide Protesters while Enabling Anti-Palestinian Racism and Islamophobia.
So this is a report that I think, initially discussed. Remind me if I'm off here, but I think in the fall we were discussing the idea of this report. And why don't before we go into the report itself, just to give people who are viewing some context, can you give everybody some context about this wave of Islamophobia and why even back in the fall we thought a report on higher education settings would be helpful?
Absolutely. So, really, ever since October 2023, we have been witnessing an immense wave of Islamophobia, anti Arab racism, and anti Palestinian racism across the country. And that is due, in large part, due to the fact that we have political leaders, corporate leaders, media executives who have been either relying on or promoting Islamophobic and anti Palestinian stereotypes in order to justify the ongoing violence against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, as well as to shield the Israeli government from criticism over their approach to Palestinian civilians. And the use of that rhetoric has had a direct impact on the lives of not just Palestinians and Arabs across the country, but also American Muslims across the country who have been physically attacked, verbally harassed, who have experienced repercussions in the workplace, and who have experienced repercussions at school as well. So, when we're talking about understanding the current wave of anti Palestinian racism, anti Arab racism, and Islamophobia we've been seeing across the country, it was important for us to analyze them at different sectors, which is why we released a report back in the fall about how Islamophobic stereotypes have been promoted by a vast array of political, economic, and social leaders across the country. It's also why we released a very brief special report on how corporate leaders have been promoting Islamophobia and targeting pro Palestine activists back in the fall. And it's also a part of why we are releasing this report now, which is a bird's eye view of the many ways in which university leaders have also come out and attacked Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students, especially those who are attempting to protest the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Thanks for that. The campus protests broke out not really that long ago on the scale of this entire episode. And what we saw happening is students bringing an uncomfortable conversation to university administrators. Be transparent with your finances. I don't know why that's so unacceptable. But also let's value human life and oppose genocide. Also, things that on the face of it seem quite reasonable to me. These are places of higher education, so you expect uncomfortable conversations, right? That's just part of what professors and the environment people want. They want to challenge people's ideas, and it's an expectation of students to interact with each other and bring their different backgrounds to test each other's ideas. So to see people in higher education, university administrators, college administrators, turn to police batons and tear gas as a way to address these conversations has just really been challenging for a lot of us. And these are student-led protests, and they've done a fantastic job of standing their ground in front of many of the things that you will talk about that have been deployed against them. So we wanted to give that context to everybody before Farah goes into the findings of the report and, more importantly, the recommendations. Before I ask you about that, Farah, I have one last point that I want to make, and I thought it was very well made in your report, right? When people feel unheard, they're going to protest, right? That is an American tradition, goes all the way back You start with the Boston Tea Party, you look at the women's suffragette movement and getting women the right to vote. You look at the civil rights movement, protest has been a part of all of these important changes that have happened in American history. But right now, according to our colleagues at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, Muslim students in particular are saying, about 68% of them are saying they feel targeted by authority where they're at, often meaning university and college administrators. So that's the context in which this conversation happens. You have in your report sort of a couple of major buckets of abuses that student protesters have faced. So why don't we start the conversation there? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, additional context, Corey. So I think that's exactly right. The report is really framed in two major buckets. And again, this is an analysis that is rooted in the current moment, of course, as we see protests, encampments spread across the country with students demanding peacefully that universities divest from companies promoting genocide. But this report also knows that these issues started way before the current moment, back in October 2023. So the report really starts in October to the present moment, analyzing over incidents at over 30 universities and colleges. And again, we have two major buckets. The first one is that universities have overwhelmingly failed to protect Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students who are being attacked on their very campuses, not just by external organizations, not just by people who seek to dox them from outside the university, but also from members of their very own institution. So, as you mentioned, Corey, we're seeing faculty members, university administrators attacking students at their institution. It reminds me, for example, of a report that came out of Rutgers, in a federal civil rights complaint filed by CAIR New Jersey and the ADC. One of the many, many incidents they highlight is that there were actually, faculty members, I believe, who would attend, a pro-Palestine protest and verbally harass students, follow them, record them, which itself is a violation of university policy. And in light of these kinds of incidents, we are also seeing universities fail to intervene, fail to adhere to their own policies against discrimination and essentially throwing their own students under the bus, either because they're Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim, or because they're expressing a political viewpoint that they might not agree with, or that challenges, their investment portfolio and their investment, in companies who are potentially profiting from genocide in Gaza. And then the second key trend that we're seeing is related, but it's that universities themselves are actually attacking their own students. It's not just that they are allowing external people, staff, students, faculty members to attack Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and other students, but it's that they are in fact attacking them themselves. And we see this, for example, right now with the use of law enforcement and police violence against student protesters. We've seen egregious incidents of police violence at Emory University, at Emerson, at Columbia University, at the University of Texas, Austin, really across the country. We are seeing peaceful student protesters being met with incredible violence. But in addition to that, even before the current moment, we've seen universities wield internal disciplinary mechanisms to punish students and student protesters who are fighting for Palestinian rights. For example, we've seen universities like Columbia introduce seemingly arbitrary policies, which were then later used to punish Palestinian or pro-Palestine student groups. So again, those are the two main buckets that we see here, and that's just to give you a broad overview, and I'm happy to discuss those in more detail.
I think that for me, a lot stands out in what you talked about, right? The violence being deployed against students. And you note in the report, and we even discussed this when we were thinking about a cover for the report, that it brought up images of Kent State from the Vietnam era. Can you give our viewers a little bit of context around that? Because yes, university administrators as well, but we note some politicians are contributing to this.
Yeah, and that's a very key segue, I think, into another point that that the report makes. It's mostly focused on universities and university administrators, but we also do call out the role that politicians have had in promoting violence or promoting disciplinary action against students. So, for example, I believe earlier in April, we saw US senators calling on President Biden to send the National Guard in to quell the protests that we were seeing at various universities. Again, these protests are peaceful, they are organized, they have very clear and legitimate demands, and they're also being organized, I mean, let's be honest, by a diverse set of students. They are being organized by Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, Jewish, African American, other students who are coming together and essentially saying that enough is enough, that genocide is not okay, and that United States government support for the Israeli government's genocide in the Gaza Strip has to end, and that universities' investments in companies that are profiting from genocide have to end. But what we're seeing, from university administrators, but here particularly from political leaders, is an attempt to villainize students, to suggest that students are engaging in hatred or violence. I believe I saw a report earlier this month that US Senator Rubio called on international students who had been engaged in these protests to be immediately deported. So these are the kinds of responses and pressures that we're seeing from political leaders who are really attempting to push university administrators even further into punishing students who are making peaceful, clear, and legitimate demands against genocide.
Really distressing stuff to hear. And I mentioned the Boston Tea Party early on. You wonder how some of these politicians would have characterized them, right? Vandals and trespassers. It's getting toward the end of the school year.
Yeah.
And without a doubt, many of these encampments are going to go away by virtue of students are going home and they may refocus their activities. In your recommendations, though, you suggest that this doesn't mean that the conversation stops now. So let's sort of start examining what are the recommendations that we're making, particularly to university administrators, to help to correct course. But yeah, how does the conversation continue over the summer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are in a moment where we're seeing the academic year end. We're seeing maybe university administrators hope that this means that it's an end to protest encampments. And so, what I'd like to suggest is that this will not go away, right? We know it won't. We know that students, even after they come back for the summer, will continue pushing for universities to divest from companies profiting from genocide. And we know that students, staff, and faculty at various universities possess anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic sentiments. So these issues will continue. And what we're suggesting for universities, our primary recommendation is for those protest encampments that do still exist, is to immediately engage in good faith negotiations with those protesters. And then for universities who have managed to come to negotiations, who've come to an agreement where students will dismantle their encampments for a conversation, for a future vote, I would highly suggest that those universities establish accountability measures so that the agreement is respected in the long term by both university administrators and students as well. And then the next thing I'll also recommend is we've seen in a number of incidents across universities that students are not just being met with criminal charges when they're arrested for peacefully protesting, but they're also being met with disciplinary charges. They're being suspended, they're being banned from school, they're facing other repercussions. And I would also highly recommend, as a part of our report, that universities drop these disciplinary charges against their students, particularly because they were introduced in many cases due to arbitrary school policies that had been used explicitly to punish one particular kind of speech, and that is speech in support of Palestine. And the second reason for that is because that is another way to build good faith between students and university administrators, not to arbitrarily punish them for engaging in free speech, academic freedom, and all the kinds of principles that universities have been expecting from their students when they admit them.
Can you've mentioned arbitrary rule changes a few times at this
Yeah.
point. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit for us? I know we want to talk about recommendations, but I
Yeah.
want folks to have an example of what we're talking about when we say that.
Of course, of course. I think I might have mentioned earlier, for example, the, incident at Columbia University, where a report emerged last fall that, shortly before, I think it was maybe 10 to 12 days before they had suspended Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine on those campuses, they had introduced new policies, and that language had been explicitly referenced when they banned those student groups, again, 10 to 12 days later. So that's one example of how we see universities kind of introducing these school policies all of a sudden, and then those policies being used to punish, pro-Palestine and Palestine, pro-Palestine students and student groups. We've seen this example across other universities as well. For example, at American University, we saw a new policy introduced in January 2024 after a term of student activism in support of Palestine that banned indoor protests. And so that was also used against Students for Justice in Palestine on that campus months later when they decided to put together a very peaceful indoor, I think they called it a silent walk through a university building. And so that's just another incident in which we see these policies being introduced, again, seemingly with the express purpose of using them later to punish student groups who have been calling for Palestinian human rights and who have been calling against genocide on their university campuses.
Thank you for helping us to understand that a little bit more in depth. So as we move toward wrapping up, you've given us the two major buckets that you wrote about in the report in terms of what we've seen happening to students. And then you've talked about the recommendations that you made in terms of, as we move into the summer, there are some steps that university administrators can take to correct course. I think it's also important that student negotiators hear you loud and clear when you say make sure there is a built-in mechanism that enforces the agreement. That like there's a third party that knows what the agreement is and will see that it is honored. Because I've heard some student groups talk about that not happening and maybe things not being respected.
Right.
I assume that will be out in the news more in the future. But if that's where, we're as we move toward wrapping up, kind of give us one or two last big points that stand out to you that you don't think you really saw so much in a lot of the media coverage. Because it felt to me there was a lot of coverage everywhere, but the national eye was particularly on Columbia. And was there anything else that it seemed like stood out to you as just like, wow, I wish more people had seen this particular piece of information?
Yeah, there are definitely a few things that I noted as I'm searching at universities that are not Columbia, but universities across the country, which really showed me just how widespread this issue was. I think, when I reflect on it, there are really two things that stuck out to me as most shocking. On one hand, I was particularly concerned by the role that not just faculty members, but also university administrators had played in attacking Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students. So recently, I read a report from a complaint filed by Palestine Legal against the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And in it, they discuss an incident last fall in which students who had participated in a peaceful sit-in, I believe, of a university building had been arrested. And at first, I believe that the complaint alleges that university administrators had said no disciplinary charges would be taken against students, that it would just be the criminal charges. A few weeks later, students received disciplinary notices indicating that they actually would face disciplinary charges. And then there was also a report that emerged in that same sequence that said that students who had been arrested were going to be banned from studying abroad the next term. And in the complaint, they also indicate that the university administrator who had reportedly been responsible for pushing that particular disciplinary action against students had himself been seen posting on Facebook a claim that was at first advanced by the Israeli military that doctors at the Al Shifa hospital in Gaza were affiliated with terrorism. And this was an Israeli military talking point at the time that, was reported really without any credible evidence, but was used to target and attack medical professionals in Gaza. And again, what I think is most shocking about this incident is you now have a very clear example, reportedly, of a university administrator who seems to possess anti-Palestinian sentiment who is responsible for disciplinary action against students who are calling for Palestinian human rights. And I think that really the idea itself that there is any faculty member, any university administrator out there who might potentially possess anti-Palestinian sentiment, Islamophobic sentiment, and they are not being, adequately held accountable should raise red alarms for everyone across the country who cares about the state of education in this country. So I think that is one particular point that stood out to me. And then the other thing that I'd like to say is in terms of doxing. I've seen a lot of reports of doxing across the country. I think a lot of the media coverage on doxing focused on the trucks that were purchased by Accuracy in Media, which reportedly went around several university campuses, sharing personal information of students who had signed statements critical of Israel. I think that one thing that narrative misses sometimes, though, or that becomes less prominent in that midst, is that students are being doxxed not just by these trucks, but by members of their own institution, by faculty members, students, or alumni who had went to that institution. So for example, at Emory, there was a report that an alumnus of the business school had created a LinkedIn post and tagged faculty members and students, called Emory Student for Justice in Palestine terror related, and then reportedly called for the expulsion of those students. And I think, again, that's another instance in which we're seeing that doxing is coming not necessarily from these trucks, but from members that are affiliated with the institution. And I don't think that those reports should be lost on us either.
Difficult information to hear. And I think, well, it's an important thing that also came through to me in the report that you wrote. And we'll make this the last point before we tell people where to go for the report and how to report it to CAIR if they feel like they've been discriminated against. But the movement, the student-led movement to oppose the genocide that's going on in Gaza is not one ethnicity or one religion. It is Muslim students, it is Arab students, it is Jewish students, it is African American students, it is Asian American students, it is all kinds. I haven't been to any of the campus protests. I know you have, but on all the protests that I have attended at other locations, it's a very diverse crowd of people united in this one understanding that genocide is just wrong, period. And these students have done an excellent job of making that loud and clear, and calling attention to the fact that many of these universities, these places where we're supposed to be pushing for critical thinking, are resistant to the idea of just transparency. Where is our money going to fund the murder of civilians overseas? That's I think, a very fair question to ask. So the report is out. If I want to read a copy of it, where do I go?
You should go to Islamophobia.org. The report is published under special reports.
Thank you very much. And it's a short one. It's 20 pages. It's a quick read. If you feel like you've been discriminated against because of your faith, because of your advocacy for Palestine, you can go to cair.com/report, or just go to cair.com, and you'll find a link, report an incident, file a report with us. Our organization provides legal and advocacy services free of charge. So, don't second guess yourself. You think you've been behind, if you think you've had a problem, go ahead and report it to us. Let us talk it through with you. Report author, Farah Afifi, thank you so much for giving us some time out of your day to talk about this product that you just put out that tells both a very troubling story, but does offer, a path forward for university administrators who may have mishandled things up till now. And hopefully this is going to be a topic we won't be talking about in the near future. Unfortunately, I think it is going to be one that's going to continue for quite some time. So if you feel like you face discrimination going forward, CAIR.com, report an incident. And from the research and advocacy team at the Council on American Islamic Relations, you're looking at our entire team. We want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us to listen to the report and showing an interest in it. we look forward to watching the genocide in Gaza stop in the very near future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.